Here's chapter 14 of The Wrong 10 Seconds. We're going back to Lydia now to see how she's coping since the video of her father has been shared and Paul seems to have cut her off. Chapter 14, Lydia, Monday through Wednesday. Lydia dug her fingernails into the tiny grooves of the Fiesta steering wheel, letting the hot plastic sear her. The heat smothered, but her tears scalded most of all. Her phone, her single lifeline on the days she and Paul couldn't see each other, sat on the passenger seat, inert. None of his contact information worked. He must have seen the video, recognized Charlie, realized Lydia knew all along what had happened to Shiana's dog, and then, what? Thought she'd arranged the whole thing on purpose? Destroyed his phone in a fit of hurt, betrayed confusion, or in protective rage on his daughter's behalf? Certainly, Lydia was wrong to hide her father's misdeed from her lover, but Paul's reaction seemed unjustified after 2 years. Then again, Lydia thinking she could replace his wife of 16 years was unjustified. His employers at the Catholic college wouldn't tolerate divorce, his agonized conscience wouldn't let him leave his daughter and wife. Paul was the real angel. Lydia was less fit than his wife, had a less prestigious career, was chronically weary although she tried not to show it. She'd merely loved him. Anyone could do that. He was a lovable person. All she had left from him were messages, intangible electronic letters pegged on the ether of the internet, now accompanied by a blank silhouette instead of a tiny thumbnail of his face. There were a couple of pictures on her phone, and somewhere a broken lace off his running shoes and a chippy fork from a late-night takeaway their first night together. Books he'd given her at Christmas and birthdays, they often gave each other books. Apparently his wife liked to say she preferred doing to reading, while Lydia thought reading was doing. But her flat was packed with other mementos, bits she'd salvaged from her childhood home at the Transatlantic, filing cabinets devoted to old doodles and daydreams, reminders of her family, Alfie so far away, and Harriet even further. Everything else drowned the scant remains of Paul. He deserved his own shrine, a whole room dedicated to him. She did not have enough to fill it. It wasn't enough she wanted to run through the city screaming, "It's not enough." She couldn't face the apartment yet, no chance. She started up Mabel the Fiesta, rolling down the windows to evaporate her sweat, and drove toward her parents' house. Charlie was at work, she remembered now, but she could see her mum. Maybe she'd tell Harriet the truth. Harriet had badgered her to keep going in upper secondary school. "I know these boys and their rumors are awful, sweetheart, but you can't let them win. Honestly, I'd sooner you went mad on the rebound and tried out loads of guys instead of shutting yourself in here." Harriet's eyes sparkled and she pulled on her cigarette. "Just don't tell your dad I suggested it." And then she'd given her gravelly laugh. Yes, Harriet wouldn't judge, and wouldn't fret as Charlie would. But today Charlie was home too. Tormenting pastry dough, glasses flowery and apron askew, presiding over an egg-spattered worktop with Creedence Clearwater Revival squalling in the background. Harriet's chair faced him, her expression brewing somewhere between mutinous sailor and terrified hostage. "Hello, Liddy lady," Charlie called. "Caramelized onion tart tonight. Are you staying?" "I'm not very hungry." The music drowned her croak. He obviously wouldn't have listened anyway. Lydia trailed her hand along her mother's shoulder. Harriet twisted to look at her, her eyes pleading with Lydia to do something, make him see sense. Lydia wanted to sink into a chair, bury her head in her mother's lap, and never get up. Instead, she trudged to the stereo and turned down the music. "There's a bad moon on the rise." "What happened at work, Dad?" Charlie slammed his rolling pin over the pastry dough. "Ah, as you are probably aware, since it must be the thing that brought you here, there's some sort of video about. Sufficient grounds, apparently, for my employers to terminate my contract at their reputable establishment. So here I am, free as a bird, to concoct various delights for the senses." Lydia watched him slap the pastry shell into a flan dish. So he thought being fired was the worst consequence possible. Well! Her heart pounded. Her throat burned. To confess she hadn't come to check on him. She had fled here. She needed her mum and dad. But she said only, "That worked out well then. Salad with a tart?" He twitched his head in an attempt to push his glasses back up his nose without getting more fingerprints on them. "Good idea. What sort of salad? Check the fridge." Lydia complied, hearing Harriet harumph behind her. Naturally confident, Harriet and Alfie never understood how easily Lydia, and perhaps Charlie, got depleted. Sorry, Mum, I haven't got the strength to fix this right now, she thought. Lydia mixed red pepper, spinach leaves and olives to accompany the tart. They ate on the little patio, the metal furniture safe to touch now the sun had retreated behind higher rooftops a few streets away. Music replaced their conversation. Lydia and Charlie took turns feeding Harriet, who looked annoyed, as if she itched to drag them up by their sagging bootstraps and force them to confront what had happened. But she couldn't, and guilty as she felt, Lydia was relieved. Lydia could barely taste the meal. 24 hours ago, she and Paul were in his car, together, as close as they could possibly be. And now he was gone? You don't mean this, my love. You can't. Charlie suggested pudding. I could whip up some rhubarb fool, perhaps. And Harriet growled, the lowest, fiercest sound she could still make. Lydia put down her water glass and assumed responsibility in her mother's stead. What will you do with the spare time you'll have now, Dad? He rummaged in his herb boxes for sprouting invaders. I suppose I'll keep your mother company, look after these plants, and create unparalleled cuisine. Through the lattices of the garden table, Lydia gazed at her feet, compact in their work trainers, and her mother's feet, once quick and dainty, now puffy from inactivity, strapped to footrests. The money won't be a problem? Without me working, we won't need carers so often, so it might balance out. Plus, there's the allowance from the government. He couldn't say disability allowance. I'll come by and help with hoisting, Lydia said. It's no problem. We'll manage. But his knees creaked and he winced as he crouched to check his courgettes. Still, there must be things you'll miss about Fairford's. You worked hard there, and for it to be gone, even if it wasn't perfect, that's... Her voice broke. That work counts for nothing now. Charlie pulled himself to his feet, gripping the table's edge. It rocked under him. Lydia leaned forward. His bitterness became a welcome distraction from her own loss. They've been so unfair, Dad. It's okay to be angry about it. Mum and I understand. Harriet hummed, eyes wide as if she were finally being spoken for. I'm not angry, Charlie muttered. Harriet moaned as though he ought to be, as though she was incensed enough for all three of them. No surprises here, though. Lydia had never seen Charlie surrender his temper. I'm sure they were within their rights, continued Charlie, sinking back into his seat. I don't know if worse is coming. She waited, but he did not elaborate. You mean if people outside work will treat you differently too? He passed his hand over his forehead. Maybe. No, never mind. Whatever this film shows, it can't be worse than how certain other people treat human beings every day. He took out his little bottle of hand sanitizer. Have you seen it? No, why would I? Lydia's stomach knotted. Charlie would want her to remain blind, but watching the clip was necessary for investigating the disappearance of Paul. She must examine all evidence. If she got a guilty verdict for herself, she could cast off this leaden mantle of betrayal and nestle, relieved, into her shame. Dad, you said the girl was unpleasant to you, right? Maybe if you explained that in your own social media post or something, maybe then Paul wouldn't be so inclined to choose his daughter over his girlfriend. Christ, what a thought! Had Lydia really sunk to pitting herself against a 14-year-old girl trying to steal her father? Some kind of angel. Paul was too good to be so turned. So was Charlie. He shrugged the idea away. She's only young. I should have known better than to let her get to me. He stood and cleared the plates. Besides, the internet is a cruel place. I can't abandon the girl to its mercy, can I? No matter how she behaved. The whole world is a cruel place, Lydia thought, and she'd been abandoned to it. She helped wash up and put Harriet to bed, then took herself home, cottoned in exhaustion so thick it made her brain creak. Slim Shady flirted with her ankles and she picked him up, not what he was bargaining for, as he liked to do things on his own terms. But he tolerated her clutch, and once she'd sat on the settee, he broke into a purr. She suspected purring did not indicate joy. Rather, it said, "You only get away with this because I and my benevolence allow it." It was the sound of a creature masking its helplessness. Charlie's babbling manifestations of panic and excitement matched exactly. Clinging to Slim Shady, Lydia watched the infamous video. First shared this morning from the ground zero of Deb Harrow's Facebook page, now it had infiltrated the local newspaper's website. It was only 10 seconds long, with Charlie in the first 4 and then the last one. First, he shoved some shopping trolleys at the dog, and at the end of the clip, he could be seen walking toward the camera. Lydia watched it several more times. His work clothes narrowed it down, and anyone could tell he wore glasses and perhaps his hair color. After seeing her father yesterday, really, yesterday? Paul would have known him here. And yet, Charlie's face was hardly recognizable. In the video's opening, when he thrust the shopping carts at the little whippet, rage contorted his features. He'd never been like this, even with his mother-in-law, whom Harriet seethed over regularly. In the video's final moment, the view jerked to his face once more. After several attempts, Lydia paused it at the right instant to study her father's expression. He appeared calm, his forehead smooth, mouth slightly smiling, eyes bright. He hadn't looked so content in a long while. Lydia had assumed it wasn't possible without her mother. She'd been selfish to think Charlie's frustration tonight was only about his job. They'd all lost so much more. She remembered ringing Alfie to tell him of Mum's stroke. "I haven't seen her yet. I'm heading to the hospital as soon as I get my things together, but I wanted to spare Dad having to explain it again." Jesus, sure. Alfie had been in Chicago working on his doctorate thesis. The thing is, Liddy, I can't picture either of them without the other. I don't have a straight bone in my body, but they're my idea of true love. If we lose Mum, what happens to Dad? Of course, they hadn't actually lost Harriet, but which was worse, feeling Harriet didn't fully exist anymore, or refusing to truly acknowledge things had changed? Either way, grief united Lydia with her father now, even if he didn't know it. She curled up on the couch and spent the night reading every online conversation she and Paul ever had. When dawn marched forward with hot, weighty steps, she left the apartment, hiking across both ring roads and through the labyrinthine developments toward the hills. She called in sick to work from a bus stop near the garden centre, then kept walking. Up a briar-tangled footpath, she reached a hilltop bristling with trees, and Lydia huddled beneath one to look down at the city. Fairford's bright blue roof, the pristine outlines of Paul's housing development, and the overlapping hulks of apartment buildings where Lydia lived herself. The canal gridded through all of it, a flat black ribbon, and the cathedral spiked the background. Lydia stayed there for hours, shifting with the shade and listening to all the sad songs she could find on her phone. The next day she returned to work. It was Wednesday, and Paul always visited his father on Wednesdays. She would plead for forgiveness. He was too kind to turn her away. It had to work. "Are you better now?" Beth asked, her eyes wide with concern. "Sure." Lydia fussed with the care plans, turning immediately to Eddie Harrow's and scanning it for mention of Paul. Matt studied her. "You changed so quickly the other day. It wasn't your mum, was it?" "No, she's all right, I guess." Thank God Matt hadn't noticed the change occurred precisely after he mentioned the so-called dog thief. No one brought up the video today. Maybe Charlie would be left in peace, to grow his garden and cook his pies. Meanwhile, Lydia dispensed medications, squinted at notes through bleary eyes, and staved off questions from Ethel and Ronald, who had minded her absence. What good was this when it no longer sustained Paul's love? "Mr. Harrow's getting fed up of his chair." Matt approached the nurse's station, his shaved head shining in the dim lights. "Shall we put him to bed?" Lydia checked her watch. Nearly supper time. Paul should be here already. "His son's coming." "Is he? I wasn't sure because he must have so much happening at home." "He'll come see his dad. Try moving Eddie from his wheelchair to the recliner and he might feel better." Soup and sandwiches and tinned fruit served in IKEA bowls arrived for the residents. Lydia hauled her cabinet, which felt more like a ball and chain than a fortress, round to give everyone their medications. Paul did not come. Lydia filled out the care plans and gave Alice some juice. Alice was enjoying the Simpsons reruns, kneading her quilt with her thin hands and chuckling. "Ah, they're very colourful, aren't they? Look at them go." Lydia handed over to the night nurse, yet another agency worker, and refused Matt and Beth's offer to get dinner with them. After all, it was only 7. Paul might still come. I really think you should leave with us, Matt said somberly, while Beth put her arm around Lydia. Lydia stepped away, eyeing the secure double doors at the ward entrance. Any second he would arrive. Thanks, but I'm not ready yet. See you later. They left, and Lydia went to Eddie Harrow's room and sat on his bed. After a few minutes, he opened his eyes and glared at her from the depths of his reclining chair. What do you want? Don't worry. Her voice trembled. Nothing you need to help with. Bugger off, then. She didn't move. He sometimes struck out with his limbs. Paul had known his wrath all his life, but he couldn't hurt her from his corner. Do you miss your wife sometimes, Mr. Harrow? He snorted. Course not. Stupid bint, skulking around like a half-poisoned rat. Overcooked a meal as often as not. Right, I suppose that's no good. My mum, though. You miss your mum? He thrashed his legs. She was a fine cook. Anything you give her, she'd have something tasty from it. Pasties and pies for our days loading the docks. And Paul, your son? Lydia nodded her hands, sweaty at his name, in her lap. He's all right, really, isn't he? Mr. Harrow tousled his hair with the 3 fingers he hadn't lost to frostbite in a Japanese prison camp. S'pose so. He brings me cider. Newspapers, too. Lydia bit her thumbnail. That's quite nice. I thought he'd come see you today. Oh? Mr. Harrow raised his eyebrows as if he never would have imagined it. Well, he better do then. I could use a good cider. He looked around. From his position, sunk into the chair, he probably saw nothing of the window but a patch of sky. Summer, isn't it? Indeed, sir. Could do with a nice sit down by the canal and drink some cider. Lydia sat with Mr. Harrow as dusk dimmed his window-squared sky, until the night staff came in and said it was too late for visitors. Mr. Harrow must absolutely go to bed now. That is the end of chapter 14, and we'll have chapter 15 up very soon. Thanks.